Good morning. I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. And today, on my YouTube channel dedicated to questions in Norse language, myth, linguistics, runes, etc., many other related subjects, I want to talk about something that has floated around on the internet for the better part of 15 years and is sometimes stated with a lot of passion, which is the notion that English is a Scandinavian language rather than a close relative of the Scandinavian languages. I think that a fair application of the criteria by someone very familiar with all these languages, and I have the not very remunerative PhD to prove that I'm very familiar with all these languages, shows that they're close relatives, but it makes no more sense to say that English is a Scandinavian language than to say that Swedish is a kind of English.
This video got a little bit long, so I just want to sum up some of the points in it before I get into the discursive nature of the talk that I did, just standing out there. And I've, of course, taken notes in my beautiful brand new Wanderer's Journal for what I want to say here. Basically, the argument is that contra pace, to use the old academic language, Jan Terje Forlund, who made the most popular version of this argument in around 2012, and it really took off from there. English is a West Germanic a West Germanic language strongly influenced by Old Norse, not a descendant of Old Norse. Now, Forlund et al. Have largely argued that English is Scandinavian based on the huge amounts of vocabulary borrowed from Scandinavian and based on the syntax, looking more like Scandinavian than like German. It is true that English does not have a very German-like syntax. However, it does not have a Scandinavian-like syntax either, is my perspective on this. If we look at some of the example sentences that are in the article that really took off and made this kind of an internet meme, you'll see part of what I mean. So this is what was really flying around out there, this Apollon article. People who talk about this are usually making arguments that ultimately can be traced to what's reported here. As again, this blew up, 13 years ago, but it did blow up and it's still rippling out there. So he says, for example, word order in English and Scandinavian, the object's placed after the verb. So I have read the book, Ich har lese Buka, versus German, Ich habe das Buch gelesen. So, and since people make fun of my Norwegian accent, God knows what the hell y'all say about my German. But anyway, so yeah, English and Scandinavian have somewhat the same word order here versus German, where German or Dutch, where the past participle is after the object. But notice a really significant way in which English and Norwegian are not the same, right? Norwegian and Swedish and Danish and Icelandic and Faroese have a suffixed article. The word the is not a separate word. The is a separate word, and it's even related. It's from an old worn down form of that in German. So English is, in a sense, kind of in a middle position here, which is exactly what you would expect given its geographical position. It leans a little bit south and it leans a little bit north. It's not like German in some respects, but it does not mean that it is not West Germanic. Then we have this example, English and Scandinavian can have a preposition at the end of the sentence. This we have talked about. Detta har vi snackat om. Okay, but notice something else that English can't do that Scandinavian routinely does do. Detta har. So the word over here in English, if I said it this word by word in English, this have we talked about. No one, aside from people who have been reading poetry forever, for so long, that they don't listen to normal people talk, thinks that that's something that somebody says in English. We can't put that object up front in average English. So that's another way that, yes, there's a similarity between English and Scandinavian languages, but there's also a dissimilarity. Uh, these other examples I don't think are particularly illuminating, although they're interesting. English and Scandinavian share the ability to make a split infinitive. So that means, if you might have had, it's doubtful anymore, but you might have had a strict enough English teacher that told you should never do this. Uh, have something between to and the verb, to never do, to always do, something like that. Most English speakers do this without ever feeling that there's something wrong with it. And Scandinavian speakers do the same thing. They put um, something between, so that to equals the or, do equals the yara. Um, Aldry would equal never, but you can put something between the infinitive marker and the infinitive of the verb. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I don't know if that's exactly persuasive. I feel like you can get there from Old Germanic grammar no matter what. In this group genitive thing, you don't see that really in Old English or Old Norse, so I think it's an independent development in Scandinavian versus English. There's also all this vocabulary. I talk about that quite a bit. Um, they is the most interesting one, but there's a ton of other vocabulary borrowed into English. Um, I think, though, that if we look at the earliest uh, large amount of text preserved in Old Norse, something like the Stockholm Homily book, that a lot of the syntax here is really not anymore like it's like the syntax of, modern day Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, English than it is like the syntax of modern German. The syntax of German has developed differently than the syntax of English. The syntax of Scandinavian has developed differently than the syntax of English. But all of these go back to some common roots. And curiously, in a lot of ways, although there have been a lot of independent changes that obscure it, the structure of English shares more at the root level with the structure of German. That's a long and short version of what I go into at much greater length in this video in a much greater place. So take a look if you're interested.
It's a pretty big topic, how we know what languages are related to what. And I have a large number of videos that get into this one way or another. For example, I have a video called Etymology Isn't Arbitrary. And to kind of sum up the point of that, it's that often people treat what language or word comes from as a kind of a game. But in fact, you can pretty objectively say most of the time. And languages are not just borrowing. Languages inherit vocabulary, right? There's this even more popular internet meme about how English, I think it's about to start as a Monty Python joke, English is a language that finds other languages and beats them in dark alleys and takes their words or something like that. I mean, English has borrowed a lot of vocabulary from other languages, but if you go back 5,000 years to the earliest reconstructible ancestor of English, as well as the Scandinavian languages, as well as Persian, as well as the Slavic languages, it's a very widespread language family. The English language has inherited, without ever borrowing, a lot of basic words, a lot of father, mother, brother, daughter, that kind of basic family language, basic numbers, pretty much your 1 to 10, and then the formants that create the numbers above that, your basic verbs, be, um, swim, right? Most of the words that you use in everyday conversation, while they have changed shape because of regular sound changes, are the same words, mutatis mutandis, as someone speaking whatever stage of English or ancestor of English going back 5,000 years. So vocabulary is not a good proxy for relatedness when, with the exception of some really out there, strange cases of languages just totally reborrowing their vocabulary. Armenian is a good example of this, where Armenian, the vocabulary is massively replaced by Iranian vocabulary. You still mostly are going to have a core that's inherited. Now, English is not on the extreme of Armenian, where it's borrowed most of its vocabulary. It's not on the other extreme of Icelandic, where most of the vocabulary remains native, right, unborrowed. But English is not actually that weird in the amount of vocabulary that it borrows from other languages. English, you know, is part of a pretty cosmopolitan, to use a Doc Holliday word, bunch of languages in Western Europe that all share a lot of their technical vocabulary derived from Latin and Greek, sometimes through a French intermediary. So, when people say that our technical vocabulary, like communication or satiety, or what's another Latin-y suffix or Greek-y suffix, theory, when people point to those and say, oh, these words are kind of the same in Spanish or Romanian or German, often German can be kind of an exception to some of these things. It doesn't mean that English is like actually necessarily directly borrowed that from any of those living languages, but rather that they're all building them from some common Latin and Greek roots. So in a sense, like, that's a little bit different from borrowing. That's kind of that English has adopted the building blocks from other languages whole. I don't know that communication, communicatio, would mean something to a Roman, but it means something to a modern Western European language speaker because we understand what those pieces of Latin mean to us. Okay, how does Scandinavian come into this? The Scandinavian languages and English are already really closely related. Probably speakers of Old English and speakers of Old Norse could converse. Simon Roper and I have made a video in which I spoke to him in Old Norse and he spoke to me in Old English, and we kind of demonstrated that, yeah, I mean, it's not the same language, but you probably have a Spanish-Portuguese level of mutual intelligibility, which is pretty good, and it doesn't take that long for speakers of one to figure out how to talk to people speaking the other, once their ears kind of adjust to some key sound changes. So when Vikings began to settle in eastern England during the Viking Age, so starting in, I don't think they're settling in the late 700s, but starting to settle in the 800s, they're already pretty well able to talk to the people around them. And because they're able to talk to the people around them, and because they settle in large numbers, and because apparently you have families that are probably a mix between, one parent speaking one and one parent speaking the other, the two languages blend a little bit. But how deep does that blending go? And, does it redefine what English is? First, we have to kind of define what English is. This is a little bit of an ambling morning video. Let me talk to you about my friends and partners at Grimfrost and some of my current projects, and I'll come back and we'll do that. Let me just interrupt this video for a minute to tell you about my friends and partners at Grimfrost.com. These guys have been in the business for a really long time, and they really care about getting the history right. They even get runes right, and I've done some of the runes for some of their products. If you're interested in historically authentic Viking Age products, that is the place you want to go. It's also a good place to get my books, especially if you live in Europe. I also want to update you on my books, my Wanderer's Journal, a blank journal with quotes from Hávamál rendered in Younger Futhark by me, as well as in my Cowboy Hávamál translation, is available for pre-order and should ship in North America by mid-April. And the second enhanced edition of my Poetic Edda translation will be available by the end of this year. It includes new poems not included in the first edition,
and thoroughly revised older poems, poems that are already there, and a thoroughly revised introduction, and a lot more fantastic looking art.
All right, so English and Scandinavian are closely related, but they're not the same thing. And how do we define English? Well, English is the Germanic language that has been the native language of most speakers in what is today's England, historically at least the southeastern part of the island of Great Britain. Since the coming of Germanic-speaking peoples to that island in large numbers, which probably begins in the mid 400s AD. What did they bring with them? Well, if we look at Old English, the earliest attested form of English, there's maybe some runic inscriptions on the continent back before they came to England that we can call like a Proto-English, but let's just stick with Old English stuff that's actually found in England. What we see is a distinctively West Germanic language. Now, West Germanic is a little bit amorphous because you have kind of a continuum of dialects with some extremes, right? High German, the dialects that are spoken in the higher elevation parts of Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and which largely form the basis of modern Standard German, are on one extreme with some really big changes that don't happen to the varieties further north. Um, we have, for example, the High German consonant shift, but also some verb inflection things that you don't see, like you see a little bit in Dutch, but then you don't see in so-called Low German, Plattdeutsch, Old Saxon in a medieval context, or Frisian or English. Uh, is it useful still to group English and German together into West Germanic? I mean, yes, I think that there are some things that West Germanic languages share that distinguish them from North and East Germanic. And some of those are deep structural things that go way beyond borrowing vocabulary. So let's consider some of what those are. One is the article. So the word the in English, German, Dutch, I don't want to say every variety of Frisian because there's some North Frisian varieties that are pretty Scandinavian-y, but West Frisian anyway. The definite article, the word the, is formed from the word that. So English, the, is a worn down form of that. German, der, die, das. These are also that. And it's a separate word that is put before the noun that it specifies. So in English, we say the boat. In German, it's das Boot, right? Just to use TV miniseries as the basis for a discussion of linguistics. As you can see, those words are pretty similar looking. Boat, boat, and you know we are dealing with languages that, again, 1,500 to 2,000 years ago were more like dialects of the same thing than different languages. And then we also see that, for example, in Norwegian, that word is båt. But to say the boat in Norwegian, it's båten, right? It's actually a suffixed article. Now, that is a big difference between West Germanic and North Germanic, is that in Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic, Faroese, you suffix the article, right? So Icelandic, the boat, báturinn, a boat, bátur. Now, there are interesting edge cases where, as I said, I think there may be North Frisian dialects that may actually do the suffixing. And then there, at least historically, were some dialects in South Jylland in Denmark that had a more German or English-like preposed separate article. It's not surprising that they might do that under heavy German influence. But in general, that's a big difference between them. What's another difference? Another difference that can help us define West Germanic is verb endings. So in the singular, we can consider, and forgive me, I am a Scandinavian. Okay, first of all, forgive me, I'm a native English speaker, obviously. You know, the whole, everything in this picture tells you that probably. But my academic specialization is in Scandinavian languages, so I generally pretty confident about those. I am not a Germanist. I read German all the time because of different articles and stuff, but I never try to speak German. So producing it, I'm very likely to make some errors that I hope people can forgive. But as I recall, in German, when you make the singular present tense of a verb, you have it's ust, ut, typically, right? Ich trinke, du trinkest, er trinket, if I'm not remembering this insanely incorrectly. And in English, 400 years ago, you have extremely similar endings to that. I drink, thou drinkest, he drinketh. All right, that's a pretty strong match. The T in German actually was once a th, like that older English ending. It's not old English. But in the Scandinavian languages, we have quite a different situation. Now, we want to look at older forms of the language because in modern Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, actually all verbs have collapsed down to one present tense ending for all forms of the verb. So this verb is drikker, no matter what in Norwegian. Jeg drikker, du drikker, han drikker, vi drikker, dere drikker, de drikker. I drink, you drink, he drinks, we drink, you folks drink, they drink. It's all the same form of the verb. But if we look at that in Old Norse, still the endings are not very similar to English or to Older English or to German. There we see, for example, ek drek, thu drekker, han drekker, and the endings of modern Icelandic are very similar. So we've got that R in the second and third person singular. That's extremely different from that ST in the second person singular in English and German, and that th in the third person singular in English and German. Now, ultimately, there's a little bit of a relationship here. The S in the old ST ending in English is ultimately from the same thing as the R in that second and third person singular in Old Norse. But you're going way, way back before English had that T at the end of the S, or before that S had become an R in Old Norse. What's happened in Scandinavian, old Z's became R's, and it's actually that the second person singular ending has been borrowed into the third person singular ending. There are some old Proto-Norse inscriptions that have an eth in the third person singular, but I don't think you could possibly find what I meant when I said 2,000 years ago. I don't think you could possibly find a Norse inscription, a Scandinavian inscription, where an S hadn't become a Z, where that S had become followed by the T, like it is in West Germanic. This is just something that is reorganized between North and West Germanic a long, long time ago. So, in modern English, descended from Old English, we say I drink, you drink, he drinks. That doesn't necessarily look that much like I drink, thou drinkest, he drinketh. The ST ending is lost in early modern English. The third person singular, that drinketh versus drinks, actually looks like what that might be is a really old difference between Southern English with the th ending and Northern English with the s ending. And what's happened is not so much that the old drinketh became drinks, but rather that the Northern drinks took over for the Southern drinketh all over the country, as Northern late Middle English kind of became the dominant dialect over time. That's a simplification. Historians of English, this video is already going to go longer than I wanted to. But English doesn't have a Scandinavian-looking verb system, right? Whatever the case, that third person singular S is not, is probably not the same thing as the R that you see in the present in Scandinavian. It is not impossible that in northern dialects of Old English, you had a situation kind of like the situation that you have in Scandinavian, where that second and third person singular S, that S ending was shared between second and third person singular, that originated in second person singular. Um, Maybe that happened and then they added the T to the second person singular, but not to the third person singular. It's a little hard to tell. Something like that could have happened. It could even be part of being on a little bit of a dialect continuum toward North Germanic, toward Scandinavian. But um, at any rate, it didn't originate from people bringing that S ending from Scandinavia, because by the time that the Norse are, again, settling in England in the 800s, their language has that R, right, not the S. Um, Sometimes I've seen an argument that because that S could have this, really kind of circuitous relationship with the R ending in Scandinavian, that we borrowed that from them. But it just doesn't work because it's already an R in Viking Age Old Norse. If we had borrowed it from them, we would be saying, he drinker, not he drinks. Um, the timing just doesn't work out. Another thing, just to keep driving nails into the differences between West Germanic and North Germanic languages as systems, is the plural. Now, if you look at English and German, their plurals are really not very similar to each other. This is a little bit of a historical coincidence. Part of it is that German has generally, like Danish actually, taken old accusative plurals, which are typically just vowel endings or end in N or in an R in some instances, but it's unrelated to the Scandinavian R, and generalize those to the nominative too. So at an earlier stage, German did have S plurals like English. When we look at Old English, look at a word like day, the plural is dagas, right? And that's directly ancestral to the S in English, days. So English and German, their dissimilarity in the plural is kind of a coincidence of English generalizing nominative endings and German generalizing accusative endings. Again, specialist simplification, but that's broadly true for a video. I don't want to be too long. The characteristic marker of the plural in all Scandinavian languages, with Danish being less so than the others, is R. So, if you learn modern Norwegian, it's tempting to just generalize, is the plural of everything, right? Dog, dogger, hest, hester. You're going to make some mistakes if you do that, because a lot of neuter nouns don't have plural, right? Fjell, fjell, mountain, mountains. But you're not too far off the mark if you just put R as the plural of everything. Just like you're not too far off the mark in English if you just put S as the plural of everything. You'll occasionally be wrong if you say like deer, deers, but not too often, and people will understand you. So actually, the system in English and Scandinavian is kind of similar. We generalize a nominative plural S. They generalize a nominative plural R, because it's the nominative plural in Old Norse or in modern Icelandic or Faroese. Actually, Faroese generalizes that to the accusative plural too. But again, the generalization happens independently. If we had generalized the Scandinavian ending, we would be talking about not mountains, but mountainer, right? So there's a timing difference here. The two languages, speaking of Scandinavian, is sort of one language community, one language cloud, have developed in some similar directions from some similar beginning places, and they've gotten to some similar destinations, but taken slightly different roads there, or taken the roads at different times. What about all of the vocabulary that English borrows from Scandinavian, from Old Norse? I mean, most noticeably the word they, right? They, them, their. The plural third person pronouns are from Old Norse, from their, theim, theira. Because if we had continued using the Old English forms of these, we'd be saying he, him, hira. It's Old English, I guess we'd be saying like hi, hyra, heim, or something. It is true that English has borrowed some remarkably central basic vocabulary from Old Norse, words that languages don't usually borrow, right? Languages don't usually borrow words for they. It would be really strange today. Think about just the language that English speakers typically encounter more than any other today. It's Spanish. People who speak a lot of Spanish or live in an area with a lot of Spanish speaking, are often inclined to use a little bit of Spanish. Amigo is pretty common. These are my amigos, or I actually probably live in an area / subculture where this is a little more common, because like I know people who will say like farol for lantern. I mean, they might say feral, but like they're borrowing a Spanish word. Um, but those are nouns, right? It would be really strange to meet somebody, especially a native English speaker, who just for some reason started saying ellos instead of they, right? It's remarkable to see a basic pronoun borrowed. Now, the fact that the Old English version of that pronoun could be confused with he, her, and him might have tempted speakers who were bilingual to adopt the Old Norse pronouns just to reduce that potential for confusion in English. So it could be a somewhat deliberate borrowing. But at any rate, it does speak to very, very close contact between these languages, and so do a massive amount of borrowings of basic verbs, nouns, and every other class of word into English from Old Norse. Sister is an Old Norse word. That's remarkable. Basic family words aren't typically borrowed. Take, get, give. These are words from Old Norse. That's remarkable, right? Those are extremely basic verbs. Among the verbs that if I put a bomb on your neck and said that you have to say take, get, and give every day or it's going to blow up, you would safely survive, right? For a long time, because every day you say take, get, and give. And they. So the language massively imported vocabulary from Old Norse at a very deep, kind of intimate level, much more intimate than the borrowings from French, right? English does borrow a lot from French later, but it tends to be kind of a little bit more rarefied, right? It's not necessarily the words that you say every day. You might say reason every day. You might say, I don't know, beef every day, but it's just not as it's not as core vocabulary as take, convey, and give. Now, probably the reason for this extensive amount of borrowing is just that people are bilingual and they know both languages well enough that they feel confident that they can use a basic word from the other in conversation in one, and that everybody involved will understand what's meant. I think that speaks to a great amount of bilingualism, but not to creolization. The system of English is still, as I have sort of laboriously, over slowly gone through here, the system of English is still more West Germanic than North Germanic. We don't have plurals in R. Our verbs don't look North Germanic. Again, we'd expect R's if we had actually borrowed those verb endings from North Germanic. We don't put our articles after nouns, right? We don't say boaten, housen, deeren, just to sort of transplant the Scandinavian system. We say the boat, the house, the deer, right? All of that speaks to the fact that English is still being continuously communicated from generation to generation of speakers, and has been for the last, let's define English as sort of starting like 1500 years ago, just with a Germanic language in England, and is a West Germanic language. West Germanic's a little nebulous. English is not necessarily in vocabulary more like German than it is like Scandinavian. It might actually be a little bit more the other way around. But in structure, Old English is continued in modern English. Old High German is continued in modern German. And Old High German and Old English are structurally a little more alike than Old English is to Old Norse. Now, I think Old English is a little bit of a dialect continuum. It's probably actually a transplant of part of a dialect continuum from the continent, where northern speakers from the continent go to northern England, southern speakers from the continent go to southern England, and your southern speakers are going to use a language that's more like West Germanic, and your northern speakers are going to have language that's a little more like North Germanic. One of the places you notice that is actually in the verb are, they are. It's sind in Old West Saxon, southern England, right, like German sind, and it's aron in Old Northumbrian English, right, like Old Norse eru. So to some extent, there are some. This answer is slightly different if we're talking about more Southern English versus more Northern English. But even so, I think that more Northern Old English still counts in its system as a West Germanic language for the reasons outlined here. People can disagree. That's fine. People can say that I am devaluing Scandinavian languages, which is a strange thing to say to someone who gave up all normal opportunities for income to get a PhD in them. But, whatever, saying that, I don't know, if you tell me something like, I don't know, if you ask me a question like, what's a beautiful place you've been to? And I say, the oh gosh, I don't know, what's a good analogy? It's and I list, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the San Juan Mountains, and the Tetons, and then you say, well, the Tetons aren't in Colorado, and I say, well, you didn't ask me about beautiful places in Colorado, and you say, why do you hate Colorado? It's like, I don't. It's like, you're just saying the two things aren't the same, right? It's saying that coffee isn't tea doesn't mean tea sucks, right? It means coffee isn't tea. English and Scandinavian are related languages, but English isn't Scandinavian. Scandinavian languages aren't English. All right. Thank you, Patreon, for your support. Thank you, everybody out there buying my books. Watch out for the second edition of my Poetic Edda translation toward the end of this year. For now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.